Hello class, welcome to your lecture on the Sophists and Socrates. Before we get into both of them, let's look at Stamatelus's chapter on the legacy of the Presocratics. For it is precisely this legacy which, as we'll see, give rise to both the Sophists and Socrates. Note also with this week that we're moving into Athenian philosophy. So far we've been all over the map, many cities in Asia Minor and also cities in the Italic peninsulas. At this point, the story of ancient Greek philosophy becomes the story of Athens and classical philosophy, which emerges as a development from Socrates, and in part as a reaction to the Sophists, who, seen aright, very often carried traces of Ionian natural philosophy with them to Athens. During this period, Presocratic ideas are sometimes integrated into the plays of the tragic poets, especially Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, comic poet, and Plato during this period was sometimes critical and sometimes admiring of the Presocratics, mentioning them both directly and indirectly. On the whole, he seems to have been more critical of Heraclitus and some Heraclidians, such as Cratylus, and he sometimes speaks ironically of the Ionian and Sicilian muses, from Anaximander to Empedocles, such as in the Sophist. For Plato, it seems Parmenides, along with Melissus, is the Presocratic who appropriately supported the unity and the immobility of being. And the cosmological narrative we find in Plato's Timaeus seems to fuse Eleatic and Pythagorean theories with some Ionian ones. Plato himself sometimes presenting his philosophy as an ontological synthesis of being and becoming. As we've seen, this may be an incorrect reading of the Ionian and Eleatic legacies, but because it's how Plato read them, it becomes subsequently something of a standard. During this period, Aristotle was critical of natural philosophers, physiologoi, his views of the Presocratics more or less completely determining our view of these early Greek thinkers subsequently. The Hellenistic age and late antiquity were not always determined by the view of the Presocratics we find in Plato and Aristotle. Hellenistic schools adopting various aspects of Presocratic physics and ethics, such as in Stoic physics, where the principle of life is a living spirit or breath, pneuma, a lot like Anaximenes, a hot, breath-like fiery substance, also like Heraclitus's fire. For the Stoics, the universe as a whole is a living organism constructed by the pneuma. This seems more related to the Presocratic Ionian legacy than to classical thought. Immediately subsequent to Plato, Epicurus, following Democritus, introduces important differences in his own atomic theory and ethics, and in the 2nd century CE, there was a genuine rebirth and flourishing of Pythagorean tradition in the movement known as Neo-Pythagoreanism, and figures such as Moderatus and Numenius. In late antiquity, from about 250 till about 750 CE, Presocratic thought continued to be influential, especially in Neoplatonism, which did not always concur with some of Plato's judgments about the Presocratics. After the rise of Christianity and the Holy Roman Empire, Presocratic or Ionian natural philosophy was more or less completely suppressed, but in the Middle Ages, copies of Anaxagoras' book and some of the poems of Empedocles were still extant in the Eastern Roman Empire and used by Byzantine scholars. In Islamic theosophical literature, we find sporadic references and allusions to eminent Presocratics such as Heraclitus and Empedocles. It was only in the Renaissance that Presocratic philosophers became more widely known, at first indirectly, probably through the Platonic and Aristotelian corpus. The Florentine Italian scholar, patronized by the Medici family, Marsilio Ficino, around this time translated Plato, Plotinus, the Orphic and the Homeric hymns, Hesiod's Theogony, parts of the Hermetic corpus, and the Golden Thoughts of Pythagoras. Some Presocratic trends can already be seen re-entering Western thought and theology in Nicholas Cusanus and his principle of the coincidence of contraries, which seems to be an echo of the unity of opposites found in Heraclitus and Empedocles. The most major coup for the return of Presocratic thought and Ionian natural philosophy to the West begins with Giordano Bruno and his view of an infinite and homogeneous universe. And we find throughout Bruno's writings peppered references to eminent Presocratics. Next, the 17th century scientific revolution, started by Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, can be characterized as a denial of Aristotelianism and a revival of Platonic, Pythagorean, and atomic philosophy. Johannes Kepler and Francis Bacon and many others were fascinated during this period by the Pythagorean Musica Universalis, and Descartes' famous Cartesian cogito, I think therefore I am, often seen as the inception and foundation of modern philosophy, can be understood as simply a reversal of the ontological priority between the thinking subject and the thinking object in Parmenides' thinking. Whereas the Parmenidean subject grasps reality objectively through thinking, noein, the Cartesian subject cognizes reality subjectively in self-reflection, the cogito. Even European idealism, beginning in the works of the Irish Bishop Berkeley, and his thesis Esse ist percipe, or to be is to be perceived, could be seen as another inroad in the Western mind made by the Parmenidean theory of being. The centrality of pre-Socratic thought, as foundational for Western philosophy as a whole, comes to be emphasized in the German philosopher George William Friedrich Hegel, who showed a special interest in Parmenides and Heraclitus. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, he declares, "There is no proposition of Heraclitus which I have not adopted into my logic." After Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche can be considered the next major original interpreters of the pre-Socratic legacy, Marx and Engels considering Heraclitus to be a forerunner of dialectical materialism. Marx's doctoral dissertation, The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature, written in 1841, but only published in 1902, compared and evaluated the physical theories of Democritus and Epicurus. This lineage and legacy for interpreting pre-Socratic thought is particularly well developed in Karatani, as we've seen. Stamatelis points out that Nietzsche was writing his pre-Socratic interpretation predominantly as a university professor, and just before the publication of the first complete edition of the pre-Socratic fragments in 1879 by Diels. We've read parts of his philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, but you can also pick up in translation transcripts of his actual university lecture courses at Basel, the pre-Platonic philosophers. As we've seen, Nietzsche regards the pre-Socratics, in contrast to the philosophers who came after Socrates, as the crown of the golden age of ancient Greek thought, and is one of the first to emphasize Socrates as really to be understood in terms of their lineage. Why were the pre-Socratics so great? For Nietzsche, there are three reasons principally. They balanced passion and action, Apollonian and Dionysian aspects of existence. They were mystic visionaries whose insight into the ground of existence was deeper than existing myth and religion, and they understood cosmic justice. After the productive readings of the pre-Socratics, and especially Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche, 20th century European philosophy, also known as continental philosophy, owes various and many great debts to the pre-Socratics. Gilles Deleuze, in his Nietzschean philosophy, describes Heraclitus as the tragic thinker, the philosopher for whom life is radically innocent and just. Heraclitus understands existence on the basis of an instinctive play and makes existence an aesthetic phenomena rather than a moral or religious one. In The Visible and the Invisible, Maurice Merleau-Ponty defines flesh in Heraclitean and Empedoclean terms as the strife of the unity of opposites. Merleau-Pontian flesh underlies our existential unity in the world, and we should probably describe it not in modern terms of matter, mind, or substance, but we should need the old term element in the sense it was used to speak of water, air, earth, and fire. So in a way, Merleau-Ponty's distinctive brand of phenomenology, which we won't cover here, can be considered as a retrieval of the pre-Socratic philosophy of the elementals. Another renowned French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, recognized the ancient roots of deconstruction and différance in Heraclitus's fragments. In his interview, Original Discussion of Difference, Derrida declared, "Yes, there is much of the ancient in what I have to say. It is to Heraclitus that I refer myself in the last analysis." The most significant reinterpreter of the pre-Socratic legacy in the 20th century is undoubtedly Martin Heidegger. In his 1927 magnum opus, Being and Time, a classic of philosophy on the level of rigor and importance as Hegel's Phenomenology, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or even the lecture notes of Aristotle, Heidegger returns to Heraclitus and Parmenides in order to overcome the nihilism of modernity and the forgetfulness of being. What Heidegger discovers in early Greek philosophy is the unmediated experience of being itself, that is, the pre-ontological state of being beyond and before metaphysics. And for Heidegger, the pre-Socratics are simply misunderstood when we read them merely as early scientists or rational philosophers. They are thinkers who search for the unconcealment, aletheia, or truth of being, and who always are attuned to what is present in presencing. Even Carl Gustav Jung, founder of analytic psychology, showed a special interest in the pre-Socratics, particularly Heraclitus. Following Heraclitus' theory of opposites, Jung stressed the existence of a conflict of opposites in human psychology, both internal and external psychic energies. In his very late autobiographical work, written when he was in his 80s, Memory, Dream, and Reflection, Jung states, "Just as all energy proceeds from opposition, so the psyche too possesses its inner polarity, this being the indispensable prerequisite for its aliveness, as Heraclitus realized long ago. Indeed, this is inevitable for, as Heraclitus says, everything is flux." Jung may have more precisely cited Heraclitus' fragment that no one knows the depth of the psyche, so far is its nature extended. A fairly clear statement already in the Presocratics of the Jungian idea of the collective unconscious. For Samatellos, Jung used Heraclitus to explain multiple personalities by introducing the opposition between introverts, in whom energy flows, concentrates inwards towards the self, and extroverts, in whom energy flows, runs outwards towards the others and the world. So this very modern psychological distinction of introversion and extroversion, Jung explicitly claims to find in some of those riddling fragments of Heraclitus concerning those who are attuned to the common world and those who turn inside towards a world all their own. As mentioned previously in the history of Western art, since the Renaissance, the two pre-Socratic philosophers to come up the most are Democritus, the laughing philosopher, and Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, most famously in Rubens. After the Renaissance, the pre-Socratics also become an increasingly important influence in the history of modern literature. Friedrich Hölderlin, who we read last week, was so far the only writer to adapt Empedocles to literature. But following this, we find Matthew Arnold's poem Empedocles on Etna, T.S. Eliot citing Heraclitus in the preface of his 4 quartets, and also a central importance of Heraclitus and other pre-Socratics in the writings of the Argentinian Jorge Luis Borges. This is just a very brief summary of the legacy of the pre-Socratics in modernity, but we get the general idea. Their importance only increased into the 20th and 21st centuries. So let's look now to the origin of the movement of sophistry, or the Sophists, and their importance in the background of the emergence of classical thought. Although not his primary subject, Stamatellos does mention the Sophists a little bit here and there, especially in his introductions. Writing, the Sophists did not constitute an organized school of thought, rather they were professional intellectuals who used to teach rhetoric, politics, and philosophy for a fee. They were strongly criticized for their views by Plato and Aristotle. Plato's dialogue, The Sophist, includes a genuine critique of the sophistic movement, while Aristotle's criticism can be found in his work, Sophistical Refutations. Plato's criticism is also expounded in the Protagoras and Gorgias, named after 2 famous sophists. The key idea for the Sophists, as a whole on this very cursory reading, is the distinction between law and nature, that is, between human creations, nomos, or law, and natural productions, or physis. Exactly what this means we're going to see richly developed by Heidegger and also Karatani in just a little bit. Why did ancient Athens have a need for the Sophists and hire them? Well, as itinerant educators, many of them came from the legacy of Ionian natural philosophy. They were not Athenian-born, but rather mostly teachers from abroad, and thereby limited by the Athenian political context, and also by their job description. Their main original contribution to the history of philosophy is the invention of the field of rhetoric. And rhetoric was particularly needed in ancient Athens because all legal and political speeches were given by the citizens themselves. No advocates, but at best a synagoros, or supporting speaker. Effective public speaking and persuasion was essentially a life skill. And great speechwriters often became important statesmen in the context of Athenian democracy. Accordingly, the sophist fragments that have survived are mostly model orations, not necessarily to be taken seriously for the philosophy they express, but often demonstrating adroitness in argumentation and debate, even as Plato critiques, making the weaker argument appear the stronger. In Plato, this becomes a full-blown critique of the Sophists for their moral, cultural, ethical, or ontological relativism. This is far from the only way to read the Sophists, but is definitely the usual one. To gain a greater understanding of the Athenian political context during the era of the Sophists and Socrates, it might be very helpful to watch the wonderful documentary, The Greeks, Crucible of Civilization, narrated by Liam Nelson, and Bethany Ann Hughes, The Ancient World, Athens, The Truth About Democracy. Required for the unit this week, you'll be watching a more recent documentary by Bethany Hughes on Socrates himself. Important political events that it's important to have some knowledge and clarity about in entering into classical Athenian philosophy are events such as the Persian Wars, the battle at Marathon, the battles at Thermopylae and Salamis, how the Athenian Empire functioned, and the Golden Age of Athens, so called, when the Parthenon was built under Pericles. The general thrust here is that Athens had become a powerful, but in some ways fragile empire during this period. Wherever there is immense political power, centered around the noble families, or in some periods of Athenian democracy in the people themselves, there will be ambivalent relationships to philosophy as such, often entailing its curtailment and use for political purposes, and this is precisely what the Sophists were paid to teach. Protagoras of Abdera is the most well-recognized name among the Sophists, associated with Greek relativism or Greek humanism in his famous statement, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, of things that are not, that they are not." Whether we take this as a statement of relativism or anthropocentric humanism, one thing seems clear: Plato did not like it at all, and devotes an entire dialogue to refuting it. Protagoras is also said to have taught that the soul is nothing other than the senses, and that everything is true. What on earth does that mean? About the gods, he's quoted as saying, "I cannot know whether they exist or do not exist, for many are the obstructions of knowledge, both the obscurity of the issue and the brevity of human life." This makes Protagoras the clearest proponent of what we would now call agnosticism. And it was for this last statement especially that he was exiled and his books banned and recalled. He is sometimes said to be the first to charge 100 minae for his teaching, and he was the originator of the kind of combative disputants now so much in fashion, and he also first introduced the Socratic style of argument, explaining how to attack and refute any thesis. It is in Antiphon that we find the clearest statement of the separation of physis and nomos, or nature and law, and we have some surviving passages from his writings, such as when he says, "Justice, then, is not violating the laws of the city in which you are a citizen. A person would gain most advantage for himself if he treated the laws as important when in the presence of witnesses, and treated the edicts of nature, physis, when alone, with no witnesses present." This seems to suggest that some of the laws of the city are not from nature or by physis, but rather are mere human conventions. It is still wise and moral to follow these conventions, to obey the law, but only publicly. In private, every individual should follow their own conscience, or more specifically, the edicts of nature. It is thus in Antiphon that we find the clearest statement of the nature-culture divide, so influential for Western thought. He goes on, "For the edicts of law are artificial, whereas those of nature are necessary. Those of the laws are the result of general agreement, not of natural growth, whereas those of nature are the products of natural growth, not of agreement." And lastly, if those who made agreements did not notice a person violating the dictates of the laws, he is free from both disgrace and penalty, and not so otherwise. But if, as is not possible, anyone violates any of the things that are ingrained in nature, the evil is not less if no one notices him, and no greater if all see him. For he does not suffer harm on account of opinion, but because of truth. Some examples here: incest might be considered as against the law by nature. Debatable, but certainly that's how it was seen, whereas finding ways to evade paying all your taxes is a violation of nomos, custom, and convention. And maybe it's okay to get away with this on occasion for the sake of a greater good. Most profoundly in Antiphon, his concern is when natural justice becomes antithetical to human law. In that case, we should only seem to obey the law for our own preservation, but at the same time should attempt to rewrite laws as much as we can so that they better accord with nature. Let's look now to Heidegger's reading of the Sophists in his 1926 Basic Concepts of Ancient Philosophy. For Heidegger, Sophism marks the moment when the world, or Dasein, human existence, including the genuine phenomena of nous, mind, logos, the word, knowledge, apprehension, spirit, truth, soul, gets lost. But Heidegger's reading of the Sophists is not merely negative. In sophistry, reflection moves from the consideration of the world to an interpretation of human Dasein, and this is indeed a positive contribution, for it is in the Sophists that we find the focus on the very possibility of human knowledge and comportment, both morally and politically. The downside of the Sophists is that truth and falsity, justice and injustice, often become a matter of subjective conviction. It may be that Heidegger is repeating the Platonic Aristotelian view here a bit more than standing for this view himself. Or it may be that in some ways Heidegger's reading of the Sophists is still determined by Plato and Aristotle. Only Karatani, as we'll see later, really breaking free of this general framework for interpretation of the Sophists. In any case, according to at least parts of the standard view, which are also Heidegger's own, Sophism is not very philosophically or scientifically productive, but it marks the emergence of cultural consciousness. Heidegger gives the etymology of Sophistes as such, the one with expert knowledge, the one who understands, and writes, only circa 450 BCE was the meaning restricted, not on account of a new theoretical determination of the concept, but because experts acquired special importance in science and in practical political affairs. What happened here? Well, just what we discussed earlier. The rise of democracy after the Persian War not only opened to the individual new possibilities of participating in community affairs, but at the same time also required a higher and more secure education, and that required teachers. Again, Heidegger, closely connected to rhetorics, was euristics, the technique of disputation, and both required a mastery of logos, dialectic. For Heidegger, the Sophists' positive contribution was the spread of culture, as well as their vitality in the introduction of cultural critique. Pretty valuable contributions, we might be tempted to say. On Plato's critique of Sophism, Heidegger writes, from the point of view of the philosophers, the Sophists appeared as mercenary peddlers of pseudo-wisdom, as self-extolling tempters of youth, trappers and fishermen. Plato's philosophical critique thrust the positive merit of the Sophists to the background. The positive aspect for Heidegger, again, are meditation on life and guidance not through oracles, mores and passions, but through thoughtful reflection. The Sophists no longer believe and imitate, but form opinions for themselves and make their own way. And what they are against is nomos, convention. What they are for is phusis, or constant change. So in Heidegger's considered reading of the Sophists here, they're a lot more like Ionian natural philosophers than they've been given credit for. What they teach is enlightenment, education, eloquence and rhetoric, and especially dialectics, that is, the ability to view things from various sides, to gain perspective, and never to absolutize any one side. I find Heidegger's reading of Pythagoras' homo mensura, or man the measure doctrine, to be brief but extremely helpful and basically correct. The doctrine reads in Greek, Panton krematon metron anthroponinai, ton men onton hos esti, ton de me onton hos uk estin. For Heidegger, its focus is on the human being as the individual, not on humanity versus animality. What the doctrine is really pointing out is that only human beings have a substantial rationality or self-conscious reason. Read this way, Protagoras is saying is not really very far from Plato in the Theaetetus when he writes, each thing is to me just as it appears to me, and is to you just as it appears to you, both you and I being humans. In Heidegger's own term, this emphasis on the individual experience will be called facticity, or the Gemeinigkeit, the mindness of consciousness. And it will again become a central principle for existentialists after Heidegger, such as in Jean-Paul Sartre. How do we know that some things are just as they appear to me, while they can also be just as they appear to you, even when what appears is different to the both of us? Heidegger's example here is wind. A wind makes one person cold, another not. Therefore, we cannot say the wind is in itself cold or not cold. And for Heidegger, there is a Heraclitean dimension to Protagoras' teaching. Not only are objects of knowledge constantly changing for individual human beings, but so is the knowledge itself. Heidegger calls this Protagoras' aesthesis doctrine, which he sees taken up positively in Plato's Theaetetus, rather than merely negatively in the Protagoras. On Gorgias' surviving text in disputational style, on non-being or on nature, Heidegger notes that opinions diverge regarding the content and aim of this text. Some believe that presented here is merely an example of the most overdone dialectics and sophistry. Others find positive and serious deliberations, to be sure not without a strong influence from the art of formal argumentation. Since Aristotle wrote a text against the views of Gorgias, we can assume for Heidegger that Aristotle would not do battle against a mere babbler. So for Heidegger, Gorgias' text here is genuine philosophy, not mere disputation. And what we find there are three theses. There is nothing, but if there were something, it would be unknowable. If there were something and it were knowable, then the knowledge of this being would be incommunicable and could not be expressed or interpreted. Heidegger, of course, does not agree with Gorgias's theses here precisely, but he notes that they constitute a valid and positive philosophy, according to which the being of beings, the knowability of being, and the communicability of what is known are denied. In a way, Heidegger's magnum opus, Being and Time, could be read as an extended response and attempted refutation of these three Gorgian theses. On the last sophist we'll be looking at, before turning to Socrates, Prodicus of Ceos, Heidegger writes, he handed down characteristic theses of the enlightened position of sophistry. Most importantly, in Prodicus, we find the doctrine that fear of death is unfounded, and this, of course, before Socrates said it on his dying days in the Phaedo. For death is something that concerns neither the living nor the dead, not the first because they are still alive, not the second because they are no longer alive. As long as the living being is alive, death is not present. When that being is not alive, death cannot possibly be present to it. And again here, the second division of Heidegger's own Being and Time, the chapter Being Towards Death, could be read as in Heidegger's partial and yet not complete rejection of this thesis in Prodicus of Ceos. Let's turn now to the figure of Socrates, beginning with the brief biography that Heidegger provides. For Heidegger, Socrates' main question was the teachability of virtue. The counter-arguments that virtue is not teachable simply don't stand. It is clear the sphere of questions posed by Socrates was already well known. Socrates is not, for Heidegger, an anthropocentering light, a new beginning or focus on the individual, but rather wholly explicable in his thinking on the basis of both the Sophists and the Ionian legacy. Born circa 470, he was the son of the sculptor Sophronicus and the midwife Phaenarete. Aristophanes' Nephili, or Clouds, was performed in 427 BCE, and Socrates was still quite young at this point, but obviously a personality well known in the city. He was indicted by Antius, Miletus, and Lycon in 399 BCE, and the charges, as everyone knows, were corrupting the youth and disbelief in the gods of the city, as well as belief in new daimons, or Socrates' personal sign. In court, he refused to make any concessions. Then he would not flee from prison, though his friends had prepared a mode of escape. In their presence, he drank the cup of hemlock after convincing them of the necessity of his action. For Heidegger, there is no clear and unanimous view of Socrates even today, and the reason is the variety of sources. 1, there's Xenophon's Memorabilia, Apology and Symposium. 2, there's Plato's Dialogues. 3, there's some indications in Aristotle. And 4, there's the depiction in Aristophanes' Clouds. Like for Heidegger, for Karatani, Socrates is better understood as a sophist from Athenian soil, fundamentally within the lineage of Ionian thinkers. Nonetheless, Plato ascribes his own theory of ideas to Socrates, and in the Sophist mounts his own attacks on the Ionian materialists under Socrates' name, likening it to the legendary battle of the gods against the Titans. For Karatani, Socrates, however, differed from Plato. The real lineage of Socrates' thought should be traced less through Plato than through such individualist and cosmopolitan thinkers as Socrates' direct disciple Antisthenes, founder of the Cynics, and Antisthenes' disciple Diogenes. So when it comes to the legacy of the real historical Socrates and his actual teaching, Karatani goes a bit further here than Heidegger to suggest that the early Cynics were in fact the true inheritors of the Socratic worldview. Plato ending up putting quite a bit of his own ideas, mostly Pythagorean ideas, into Socrates' mouth. Supporting this view, Karatani cites Diogenes Laertius, who speaks of Antisthenes' rejection of the theory of ideas, remarking once at a parade, "Plato, I see a horse, but I do not see horseness." A very witty quip indeed. I would have loved to see Plato's face in that moment. And when Diogenes of Sinope, another early Cynic, asked what country he hailed from, he replied, "I am a citizen of the world, a cosmopolite." These remarks allow Karatani to infer that Socrates himself should be seen as a cosmopolitan who would have rejected the theory of ideas. So for Karatani, Socrates should be placed within the history of Ionian natural philosophy, along with the Sophists. What the Sophists did was essentially to cast doubt on the senses of legal justice that vary from culture to culture, that is to point out cultural relativism. They sought the basis of justice in a physis or natural law that underlay all of these. This emphasis on physis being very Presocratic indeed. Based on this idea of natural law, the 4th century BCE sophist Euthydemus claimed, quote, "The gods set the myriad of people free. Nature has made no one a slave." Socrates' pupil, Antisthenes, asserted that the distinction between free man and slave and the prejudice between man and woman are rooted in nomos, hence must be set aside if one follows phusis. For Karatani, Plato and Aristotle were not in agreement with these lines of reasoning against slavery and for natural equality. On the contrary, Aristotle concludes, "It is clear, then, that some men are by nature free and others are by nature slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right," and similar remarks can be found in Plato's Republic. We're also returning this week to Pierre Hadot. We read a few chapters from him at the beginning of the course, and now we're going to start a more methodical reading of his book, What is Ancient Philosophy? In his chapter, The Figure of Socrates, he underlines how often Socrates has been compared to Jesus Christ. Both were martyrs for new ways of thinking and of ethical life, and after both died, their disciples founded schools to spread their message. Furthermore, the schools founded by the Socratics vary as widely as do various early forms of Christianity. And this indicates, like in the case of Christianity, the complexity of the Socratic message. And it is extremely difficult for us to say anything definite about the historical Jesus or the historical Socrates. Hadot points out that only one of Socrates' initial disciples, that is Plato, triumphed over history, and he did so because he was able to give his dialogues an imperishable literary form, and because the school he founded survived for centuries, thereby saving his dialogues and developing, or perhaps deforming, Socrates' original doctrines. We would perhaps have a wholly different idea of who Socrates was if the works produced in all the schools founded by his disciples had survived. The sprawling Jesus literatures of the first few centuries of the Common Era has its analog in the sprawling Socrates literatures of the 4th to 3rd centuries BCE. The common feature is that in all these literatures, an original charismatic founder is turned into a mask for the expression of the opinions of a particular writer. His historical existence seems to have inaugurated a unique relationship between the author and his work on the one hand, and between the author and Socrates on the other. The author of the Socratic dialogue pretends not to be involved with his work and apparently content merely to reproduce a debate which once opposed conflicting theses. At most, we can presume that he perverts the thesis which he makes Socrates defend. In a sense, then, he takes on the mask of Socrates. Such is the situation we find in Plato's dialogues, in which Plato's own individuality never appears. So given the difficulty of saying anything definitive about the historical Socrates, what can we say with a relative degree of certainty? Well, he taught the importance of knowing oneself. His character was one of extreme charisma, always committed to midwifing other people's ideas. His method focused on teaching other people to think for themselves. He was apparently quite ugly later in his life, but perhaps quite handsome earlier in his life. As we learn about in a recent book by Darmon Dangour, Socrates in Love, attempting to reconstruct the earlier life of Socrates. He was very funny, he was a very good soldier, very intense to be around, seems to have been mostly poor most of his life, to have practiced moderation, any excesses seeming to have no effect on him, to have practiced both the state religion as well as a personal religion, and above all, to have loved philosophy for its own sake. As to his doctrines, he is most famous for claiming that all he knows is that he knows nothing, although this is probably just an example of the irony of Socrates. For looked at closely, he does seem to know quite a lot, and to have been most influenced during his early years by Anaxagoras' doctrine of mind. Socrates, in his mature period, is often described as a strictly ethical thinker, concerned with justice and the overall health of the soul, or care of the soul, through philosophical inquiry. The idea that any of these positive doctrines and many more could be simply dismissed because Socrates knows that he knows nothing, and that's all you need to know, is really a tremendously superficial understanding of Socrates. And I really wish undergraduate students would stop parroting it and think that they've accomplished something. The most important characteristic of Socrates from the point of view of religion is the phenomena of his guardian spirit or daimon, and he seems to have had a very personal connection with an inner deity. Whenever he was discussing philosophical matters, his daimon or spiritual double would warn him what not to think, but never what to think. That part was up to him and his interlocutors. Because Socrates privileged this interior voice or religious conscience over the prevailing views on religion and piety in his culture, he was accused of impiety and atheism. This, more than anything, is what made Socrates a lot like the other sophists. And in this sense, Socrates was an Athenian-born sophist, putting nature above culture and convention. Because he loved his city-state and in fact practiced the state religion very diligently and piously throughout his life, he vehemently and correctly denied these charges and claimed in the Apology that his philosophical activity was actually under the protection of traditional Greek gods, especially the god Apollo. When studying the figure of Socrates in the Platonic dialogues, it's very common for scholars to say that the earlier dialogues are recollections of things that Socrates actually said and did, while later dialogues tend to utilize Socrates as a mouthpiece. So which are these early dialogues? Well, they usually include the Charmides, Crito, Euthydemus, Euthyphro, Gorgias, Hippias Major, Hippias Minor, Ion, Laches, Lysis, and Protagoras. Lastly, the Apology, recounting the trial of Socrates, is usually thought to be the last of the early dialogues. Things get a bit hairier, however, when we look to the Phaedo. Most scholars believe that the Phaedo is not an early dialogue due to its emphasis on the theory of forms. It does, however, claim to be an adequate account of Socrates' last day. Furthermore, when we study the later dialogues, we very often find Socrates saying things that he very well might have said. Figuring out where Socrates ends and Plato begins and vice versa is almost impossible, but when we read Plato and Plato's Socrates, we have no choice but to try. So let's begin that task this week and in the next few weeks. The account of the character of Socrates we get in Hadot goes a little like this. Having been a tough and courageous soldier, he walked about barefooted in winter and spent whole days and nights standing still, thinking about a philosophical problem. He could drink his companions under the table, but was never seen drunk. Ugly and poor, at least in later life, he is moderate almost to a fault, requiring little in the way of material goods. He refrains from homosexual relationships with young men that were common in the upper classes in Athens at the time. Much as we'll see to Alcibiades' chagrin, he spends his days in public squares or the agora, talking to anyone who is interested and mostly asking them questions. His arguments seem poor things, Alcibiades says, about tailors and horse traders, but once you get inside them, you see there is no others to compare. Socrates himself thinks he has been sent to Athens by a god to urge citizens to virtue, his metaphor for himself being the gadfly. We get a wonderful account of the character of Socrates in Plutarch in the 2nd century CE. Most people imagine that philosophy consists in delivering discourses from the heights of a chair and in giving classes based on texts. But what these people utterly miss is the uninterrupted philosophy which we see being practiced every day in a way which is perfectly equal to itself. Socrates did not set up grandstands for his audience, and he did not sit on a professorial chair. He had no fixed timetable for talking or walking with his friends. Rather, he did philosophy, sometimes by joking with them, or by drinking, or going to war or to the market with them, and finally by going to prison and drinking poison. He was the first to show that at all times and in every place, in everything that happens to us, daily life gives us the opportunity to do philosophy. On the charismatic effects of Socrates, Hadot points to Alcibiades' speech in the Symposium. When we hear any other speaker, even a very good one, he produces absolutely no effect upon us, or not much, whereas the mere fragments of you and your words, even at a second hand, and however imperfectly repeated, amaze and possess the soul of every man, woman, and child who comes within hearing of them. And if I were not afraid that you think me hopelessly drunk, I would have sworn as well as spoken to the influence which they have always had and still have over me, for my heart leaps within me more than that of any Corybantian reveler, and my eyes rain tears when I hear them. Wow, that's a very charismatic effect indeed that Socrates is said to have had. And if that wasn't enough, Alcibiades goes on, and I observe that many others are affected in the same manner. I have heard Pericles and other great orators, and I thought they spoke well, but I never had any similar feelings. My soul was not stirred by them, nor was I angry at the thought of my own slavish state. But this Marsyas has brought me to such a pass that I have felt as if I could hardly endure the life which I am leading. This, Socrates, you will admit, and I am conscious that if I did not shut my ears against him and fly as from the voice of the siren, my fate would be like that of others. He would transfix me, and I should grow old sitting at his feet. For he makes me confess that I ought not to live as I do, neglecting the wants of my soul, busying myself with the concerns of the Athenians. Therefore I hold my ears and turn myself away from him, and he is the only person who ever made me ashamed, which you might think not to be in my nature, but there is no one else who does the same. A common question posed by undergraduate students is how someone so reputedly ugly as Socrates was in his later years could have had such a charismatic effect. Again, Dangour points out that Socrates may not have always been so ugly or subject to the ravages of old age. During the period recounted by both Plato and Xenophon of this great conversation we call the Symposium, during which Alcibiades spoke these magical words regarding the charismatic effect of Socrates, he may very well have looked more like a distinguished middle-aged thinker, rather than the pot-bellied, snub-nosed old man he often joked himself to be during the final phases of his life. Clearly, the most important characteristic of Socrates' teaching is his questioning attitude and instilling of a questioning attitude in others. Socrates does not preach or lecture, he asks questions. His aim is to help others give birth to ideas within themselves as a midwife helps women to give birth, and then to determine whether those ideas are true, as a midwife used to determine whether the baby was legitimate. This process involves examining idea after idea, discarding those that are seen as faulty, and moving closer and closer to opinions that are, as Xenophon says, like the truth. On the significance of Socratic existence, that is the life of Socrates himself, Heidegger points to Socrates' most enduring legacy being to get us to really pay attention to the distinction between what we actually understand and what we do not understand. The correct response to ignorance is neither omniscience nor the hastiness of common sense, but the appropriation of genuine knowledge versus superficial chatter. And here we find a pre-form of Heidegger's own concept of the chatter of the they, das Man. For Heidegger, Socrates' lack of a preconceived thesis regarding knowledge itself, what it is and what its scope is not a deficit but rather a positive trait which sees knowledge as a quest, and goes back to the very etymology of philosophy as philosophia, love of or quest for wisdom, rather than sophos, the model of the sage. Despite this ironic non-knowing for Heidegger, there is a positive conception of knowledge in Socrates. That is the conviction that it can be produced through a combination of virtue and skill or technique. What something is, the Greek ti estin, in its essence or potentiality to be, can be inched towards with sureness and transparency, and self-knowledge is the key to this quest. Knowledge for Heidegger's Socrates is still more a practice, a phronesis, knowing what to do in particular situations, than it is a merely abstract theory of wisdom. Socrates always fundamentally and essentially attempting to achieve this knowledge, awakening of an understanding of it, and implanting an instinct for it. For Heidegger, Socrates does not present a new content or ideology, a new ism, rather everything is already there and just needs to be shaken and stirred into the right orientation. What Socrates opens is the possibility of grounding knowledge, not a novel scientific result, and in this way Plato and Aristotle become possible only on the basis of Socrates. What he provided positively in the final analysis is simply a methodology, that is, relentless questioning geared towards the apagoge, that is, leading of the soul towards a more primordial way of viewing phenomena. This methodology of the apagoge, or paideia, education, can be further described in Socrates as a maieutic, that is, a clearing of the ground for the clearer perceptions of what is, rather than a mere imparting of cognitions and doctrines. In this way, for Heidegger, Socrates seems to have been the first authentic phenomenologist. On Socrates and the birth of the concept, Heidegger writes, "The concept as such is explicitly made prominent and understood precisely as a concept, expressed in the Greek phrase logon didonai, to investigate and pose the ground expressly as ground, or to attempt to grasp the essence, that is, not running about and gathering properties haphazardly, mere observation, but on the contrary, to observe in terms of one's prior grasping of the ground, what maintains itself throughout variation and modification." For Heidegger, what Socrates teaches is apprehension itself, the general, the universal, katholou, itself a being or not, We don't know in Socrates yet what the concept really is. Is it only a signification? What does the concept itself mean? For Heidegger, he would like to stop here with Socrates and not move on to Plato and Aristotle. For Socrates, logos, the concept, signification, is meaning. Meaning is an expression of being. We may not in fact need Plato's general theory of ideas, but its impact on Aristotle, in order to grasp the pure and essential form of the concept. On the care of the soul, Heidegger interestingly states that it's not about caring for nature and not about caring for man, but rather about caring for existence. Socrates was not a moralist who disdained the philosophy of nature, but on the contrary, his concern was the understanding of human knowledge and action in general. He was no more concerned with determinate domains of the knowledge of nature than he was with the ethical principles of delimited content, or even with a special value system and its particular hierarchy of values. So basically, the Socrates that almost every philosophy professor has been giving us for decades and centuries is quite wrong, according to Heidegger. Socrates thought much too radically for such contingent matters to hold him fast. Theoretician, practitioner, dialectician, moralist, prophet, philosopher, religious personality, Socrates' concern is the being of the human being, or what Heidegger calls Dasein. Let's move on now to Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates. We only get a very little bit of Xenophon's Memorabilia in our textbook, specifically from later parts where Socrates, interestingly, is presenting some doctrines on the teleology or purposiveness in nature. But since Xenophon, alongside Plato, are our two most important and extensive sources for Socrates, it's a good idea to slow down here and get a better idea of the Socrates we find in Xenophon. Xenophon was an Athenian historian, philosopher, and military adventurer, a year older than Plato, and remarkably, all of his works have survived. Indeed, 4 concerning Socrates: the Apology, Memorabilia or Socratic Memoirs, Symposium, and Home Economics. The reason our textbook barely covers him seems to be because it concurs with the pretty lame, in my view, opinion that gives Plato's portrayal absolute priority. To be sure, while some of Xenophon is a bit boring and flat compared to Plato, and certainly not as positively flaring in literary style, nevertheless, many parts of Xenophon are entertaining and quite important. In Book 1 of Xenophon's Memorabilia, we read, "I've often wondered what arguments Socrates' accusers can possibly have used to convince the people of Athens that he deserved execution. The indictment against him ran something like this: Socrates is a malefactor, first, in that he does not recognize the gods recognized by the state, but introduces new deities. Secondly, in that he corrupts the youth. With regards to the first charge, that he did not recognize the gods recognized by the state, on what evidence could they have possibly relied? Everyone could see that he sacrificed regularly at home and also at the public altars of the state, and he made no secret of using divination, and in fact, it was common gossip that Socrates claimed that the divine communicated to him." Most philosophy professors seem to be simply incapable of taking on board the genuine testimony here that Socrates practiced divination, and no, not just his divine sign. This, I imagine, was the chief reason for accusing him of introducing new deities, that is, his divine sign, not the usual practice of divination. Yet he was no more heretical than any other people who believe in divination and rely on portents and omens and chance meetings and sacrifices. Already at the beginning of Xenophon's Apology, we find a Socrates who is indeed deeply religious in both traditional and non-traditional ways. Socrates asserted what he actually believed. He said that the divine does the communicating. He often warned his associates to do this and not to do that at the prompting of the divine, and those who took his advice benefited from it, while those who did not were sorry for it afterwards. Surely anyone would agree that Socrates did not want to seem either a fool or an impostor to his companions, and he would have been thought both if he had been manifestly mistaken in making what he claimed to be divine revelations about the future. It seems obvious then that he would not have predicted the future if he had not been sure that his statements would come true. And who would base his trust on anything other than a god? And if he trusted in gods, he must surely have believed in gods. This emphasis on Socrates' practicing of divination and even predicting future events is not particularly highlighted in Plato, but there's no reason to believe here in Xenophon that it's false. In fact, in almost all aspects of his daily routine, Socrates was extremely pious. Early in the morning, he used to make his way to the covered walks and recreation grounds and when the agora became busy, he was there in full view, and he always spent the rest of the day where he expected to find the most company. Nobody ever saw Socrates do or heard him say anything that was heretical or irreverent. He did not discourse about the nature of the physical universe as most other philosophers did. He pointed out the foolishness of those who concern themselves with such questions. In the first place, he inquired whether they proceeded to these studies only when they thought they had a sufficient knowledge of human problems, or whether they felt that they were right in disregarding human problems and inquiring into divine ones instead. So Socrates' centering of philosophy and questioning in the human sphere is here not counter to traditional religion, but rather the basis for an authentic engagement with it. And this is almost similar to the inclination of pietist Christianity, where what matters in the religion is to have a changed perception and heart, not at all the following of dogma and doctrine. On Socratic humility, Xenophon writes, he expressed surprise that it was not obvious to them that human minds cannot discover these secrets, inasmuch as those who claim most confidently to pronounce upon them do not hold the same theories, but disagree with one another, just like lunatics. He himself always discussed human matters, trying to find out the nature of piety and impiety, honor and dishonor, right and wrong, sanity and lunacy, courage and cowardice, state and statesman, government and the capacity for government, and all other subjects the knowledge of which he thought marked truly good men. Note that if indeed Socrates regularly discussed issues of state, this might imply that many of the propositions we find in Plato's Republic are of a Socratic provenance. Perhaps only the books in which Plato expounds his own theory of knowledge and ideas, being not in some sense faithful accounts. On the gods of Socrates, Xenophon writes, he believed that the gods care for men, but not in the way most people do. They suppose that the gods know some things, but not others. But Socrates believed that they know everything, both words and actions and unspoken intentions, and that they are present everywhere and communicate to people about all kinds of human affairs. So I cannot understand how the people of Athens were persuaded that Socrates was heretical in his religious beliefs when he never said or did anything irreverent, and on the contrary, in his relationship to the gods, said and did only what was recognizably consistent with the deepest reverence. Again, we see traces here of Plato's conception in books 2 and 3 of the Republic of the univocal goodness of the gods. On the charge of corrupting the youth, Xenophon writes, it also seems extraordinary to me that any people should have been persuaded that Socrates had a bad influence on young men. He was, in the first place, the most self-disciplined of men in respect of his sexual and other appetites. He rescued many young men from these states of irreverence, criminality, greed, sensuality, and laziness by inspiring them with a desire for goodness and offering hope. In eschewing fees, he considered that he was protecting his own independence. Those who accepted a fee in return for their services, he nicknamed self-enslavers because they were obliged to converse with those who paid the fee. Note here the Sophists, as foreigners teaching in Athens, would have more or less only been there for the collection of the fee, Athens being a very prosperous empire at that time. Yes, Socrates was poor, but he wasn't so poor that he had to accept payment for his teaching like the Sophists. This is a mark in his favor, but also a kind of underlining of Socrates as an Athenian sophist, but one who, since he was a citizen, had the freedom to eschew fees since he was allowed by law to own property, and indeed he had some. Socrates' accusers point to the fact that two students of Socrates, Critias and Alcibiades, ended up turning out very badly. Xenophon retorts that as long as they kept company with Socrates, they were able to master their ignoble desires. Socrates' accusers hold him responsible for the faults of his students. But in reality, in their youth, when they were under the influence of Socrates, both behaved better than they did once they left his tutelage. Xenophon's story here decisively puts an end to the myth there's no such thing as a bad student, and is consonant in all the specific details with the allusions to Alcibiades we also find in Plato's Republic. On Socrates, on virtue and vice, Xenophon writes, is courage a matter of teaching or a natural gift? Courage is significant here among the virtues, because it was generally considered to be one of those things built in by nature. The idea that even courage could be learned reflected a very refined philosophy of education, and one which we still practice today when we don't berate a child who has a stammer, for instance, but rather get to the root of their fear of speaking and replace it and cultivate instead their natural disposition to speak. Socrates, courage, like every natural disposition, can be developed in the direction of fortitude by instruction and application. So there's nobody out there who's just really bad at math or really bad at Greek philosophy. Both these things can be learned with diligence and solid instruction. In this pragmatic sense, wisdom for Xenophon's Socrates is not much more than prudence or phronesis, as Heidegger also quoted, not knowing that something is the case, but knowing how to go about doing things. And not only justice, but all the other moral virtues are wisdom and can thus be learned. Just actions and any others proceeding from a virtuous motive are good, and the wise person performs truly good actions. Those who are not wise could not, and if they tried to perform good actions, they'd fail. This is in Xenophon an indication of the famous Socratic equation that justice equals wisdom equals virtue. There is a wonderful passage in Xenophon where Socrates considers ignorance to be a kind of madness. Socrates also said madness, or the Greek mania, is contrary to wisdom. This doesn't sound quite like the encomiums to madness we find in Plato's Phaedrus and Symposium. Yet he did not think that mere lack of knowledge was madness, but to be ignorant of oneself and to form opinions about and think that one comprehends what one does not know. This, in his view, was very near to madness. So believing that one understands what one does not understand is the root of madness in the human sphere for Socrates. He said that most people did not consider that those who blundered about in things that were generally unknown were crazy, but they called those crazy who were mistaken about things that were generally known. So the person who is wrong, according to the dictates of common sense and the nomos, is to be distinguished from the mad person, in that the mad person is oriented almost entirely by what is unknown, lacking even public common sense. This seems to be a fairly sociological definition of madness, and perhaps it contains just a touch more psychological acumen even than Plato's veneration of the divine or God-given madnesses versus the pathological ones. The next episode in the Memorabilia I want to particularly underline and dwell on is the charming dialogue that occurred one day between Socrates and the courtesan or hetaira Theodote. I'm simply not sure why this episode is not more frequently underlined in introductory lectures to Socrates, for it seems to be the parallel in the Socratic legacy of Jesus' close relationship to women such as Mary Magdalene. Xenophon recounts, "At one time there was in the city a beautiful woman called Theodote, who was of the sort to consort with anyone persuasive. One of the company had mentioned her and remarked that her beauty was beyond description. He added that artists visited her to paint her picture, and that she let them see as much of her as was proper, perhaps an indication that that was quite a lot. 'We ought to go and see her,' said Socrates. 'We can't form a clear idea about what is beyond description from hearsay, now can we?' A very human Socrates here, who as much as any man appreciates the sight of a beautiful woman. So off they went to Theodote and found her posing for a painter, and they took a good look at her. When the painter had finished, Socrates said, 'Gentlemen, ought we to be more grateful to Theodote for letting us see her beauty, or she to us for looking at her? I suggest that, if the display has been more to her advantage, she ought to be grateful to us, and if the sight has been more to ours, we ought to be grateful to her.' Seriously, what a funny thing to say. And how do you think Theodote replied? With all the modesty and circumspection of an important hetaira, of course, completely agreeing with Socrates. 'Well then,' he went on, 'she is already enjoying the tribute of our admiration, and when we have spread our report, she will benefit still further. On the other hand, we are now desirous of touching what we have seen. We shall go away with our emotions titillated, and when we have gone, we shall feel an unsatisfied longing. The natural inference from this is that we are performing the service and she is receiving it.' Again here, a very playful and flirtatious Socrates seems to be an expert at talking with everyone, and perfectly plays Theodote's own game along with her. 'I must say,' said Theodote, 'if that's how it is, I shall have to be grateful to you for looking at me.' 'Tell me, Theodote,' he replies, 'have you got a farm?' 'Not I,' she said. 'Well then, a house that brings in money?' 'Nor a house.' 'Perhaps you have some slaves who work at a craft?' 'No, none.' 'Then how do you support yourself?' 'If anyone gets friendly with me and wants to be generous, that's how I get my living,' she replies. 'Good heavens, Theodote,' said Socrates, 'it's a splendid asset to have a flock of friends, much better than having a flock of sheep and goat and cattle. But tell me, do you leave it to chance whether a friend wings his way towards you like a fly, or do you devise something yourself to catch the friend?' 'How could I find a device to bring that about, she asked. You could do it much more naturally than a spider. You know how spiders hunt to support themselves. They spin webs and feed on anything that flies into them. Are you advising me to weave some kind of snare too, she asked. No, you mustn't expect to hunt friends, who are the most valuable prey of all, as simply as that. Well, said Theodote, what method might I use to catch friends? Surely by providing yourself with a human hound, who will track down men of wealth and good taste, and after finding them, divine a means of driving them into your nets. Nets, said she, what nets have I got? Notice here a couple of things. One is Socrates' penchant for animal metaphors. Describing himself as a gadfly elsewhere in many places, he here describes the courtesan as a spider. What is more, within this playful dialogue, he seems to offer his own services as a pimp, graciously understanding Theodote's plight and suggesting she could use a man like him to bring her the most desirable client friends. What sort of nets does Theodote have? One certainly, said Socrates, which is very close in folding, your body. And in it is your mind, which teaches you how to look charming and talk gaily, and tells you that you must give a warm welcome to an attentive lover, but bolt the door against a selfish one, that if a lover falls ill, you must look after him devotedly, that if he has a stroke of luck, you must share his pleasure enthusiastically, and that if he cares for you deeply, you must gratify him wholeheartedly. As for loving, I am sure that you know how to love not only passively, but with real affection, and you convince your lovers that you are fond of them, I know, not by words, but by deeds. It's almost as if Socrates is trying to convince Theodote to give up her spiritually poor clientele, but rather to cultivate fewer lovers of higher quality, along with all that would be involved in that. Approaching matters in this way seems to have honestly not occurred to Theodote yet. I don't use any of those methods. Then again, said Socrates, it's much better to keep one's human relationships natural and right. You can't capture or keep a friend by force, but by showing the creature kindness and giving it pleasure, you can both catch it and keep it. That's true, she said. So Socrates' advice to Theodote is basically, care for the people who care for you. Satisfy them when it's little trouble, cultivate attachment from your clients, but also lead them on a bit, accentuate their appetites, and arouse their hunger for what you have to give. It seems here in this charming dialogue with the courtesan that Socrates' intention, like elsewhere, is sincere and helpful. And he goes on just a bit more, turning up the heat a bit. Why surely, said Socrates, if when your admirers are satiated, you neither offer nor hint at your favors until the satisfaction has passed, and they feel the want again, and next, when they most feel the want, if you drop hints by a combination of the most modest behavior and obviously wanting to gratify them, and by obviously holding back until their need is as great as possible, for the same favors are much better then than before the desire for them is aroused. Theodote, why don't you help me in my hunt for friends, Socrates? So Socrates gets the job. I will, believe me, if you persuade me. Classic Socratic irony. Theodote, how can I persuade you? Uh-oh, where's this going? You'll look at that yourself, he said, and you'll find a way if you need any help from me. Then come and see me often, she said. Clearly, Socrates has won a very fun new friend. But instead of taking her up on her very noble offer, Socrates, playing classic hard to get, well, Theodote, replied Socrates, poking fun at his own avoidance of public life, it's not very easy for me to find the time for it. I have a great deal of private and public business that keeps me occupied, but I have some girlfriends too, who will never let me leave them by day or night, because they are learning from me about love charms and spells. Do you really know about those things too? She asked. Why do you suppose that Apollodorus here and Antisthenes never leave me, and that Cebes and Simmias come to visit me from Thebes? You may be sure that these things don't happen without a lot of love charms and spells and magic wheels. Socrates here indicating that his privileged disciples as well learn as much about the arts of love from him as about philosophy. Lend me your magic wheel then, so that I may spin it first for you, replies Theodote, now here of course completely won over. Certainly not, he said. I don't want to be drawn to you. I want you to come to me. Very well, I will, she declared. Only mind you let me in. Yes, I'll let you in, said Socrates, unless I have someone with me that I like better. What an absolutely charming end to a very charming conversation. It makes me blush a bit to recount it, but certainly I admire Socrates no less after reading it. On the more serious matter of Socrates' view on piety and religiosity, and somewhat as preparation for reading the Euthyphro in a minute, let's look next at Socrates' conversation on religiousness with Euthydemus in Xenophon. "Tell me, Euthydemus," he said, "what sort of thing do you think religiousness is?" "A very fine thing, to be sure." "Can you say what sort of person a religious man is?" "I think he is a man who worships the gods." "Can one worship the gods in any way one likes?" "No, there are laws which must be observed in worshipping." "Then a person who knows these laws would know how one ought to worship the gods?" "That is my opinion." "Does anyone worship the gods in a different way from that which he thinks he ought to worship them?" "I imagine not." So we may take it that the man who knows what is lawful as regards to the gods could be correctly defined as religious. Do you know what is meant by right, what the law commands? As the dialogue goes on, Socrates seems to define religiousness or piety as knowing or doing what is lawful. Wisdom, knowledge, goodness, and fineness all coming together in accord in this idea of piety. The wise person should be properly instructed and educated in every subject, and in correct religious observances above all, since it is in these that all the proper virtues of knowledge and effective action reveal themselves. If anybody wanted help beyond the resources of human wisdom, he advised him to take up divination. A man who knew the means by which the gods communicated to men about events, he said, was never in lack of divine counsel. Again, the intense religiousness of Socrates' personal and public life is underlined. And so it is odd that very often when we hear summaries of Socrates, such as even in the Bettany Ann Hughes video we'll be watching this week, the Western myth of the atheism of philosophical thinking versus traditional religion is rather underlined as characteristic of Socrates' legacy. There is simply no evidence for this in the surviving testimony. And as an interpretation of Socrates' divine sign, it is poor philology. In the conclusion of the Memorabilia, we hear about the injustice of Socrates' death sentence, but also how, in a way, it was a good thing. According to his own accounts, the Athenians helped Socrates to avoid the most disagreeable part of life, old age. What death could be nobler than a death most nobly accepted? What death could be happier than the noblest? And who could be more beloved of the gods than the happiest? When Socrates heard about his trial, Hermogenes told him he should be considering his defense much more seriously, and he replied, "Don't you think my whole life has been a preparation for it?" During the period of his trial, Socrates continued to spend all his time in studying nothing but questions of right and wrong, doing what was right, and he considered that this was the best preparation for his defense. Hermogenes is appalled. "Don't you see, Socrates, that the jurors at Athens have often before now been prevailed upon by argument to put innocent men to death and to acquit the guilty one?" "Yes, but as a matter of fact, Hermogenes," he said, "when I was trying to consider my defense before the jury, the divine opposed me straight away." What this literally means is that Socrates had no intention of mounting a sustainable defense. His divine sign opposed it. "That's remarkable," said Hermogenes, and indeed it is. Socrates laughs a bit. "Do you think it's remarkable that God should decide that it is better for me to end my life now? Don't you realize that up to now I would not have conceded to anyone that he had lived a better or more pleasant life than I? For I believe that the best life is lived by those who take the best care to make themselves as good as possible, and the pleasantest life by those who are most conscious that they are becoming better. If I go on living, I shall probably have to pay the penalties of old age. My vision, hearing, and intelligence will become impaired. I shall become in consequence slower to learn and more forgetful, and inferior to those to whom I used to be superior. If I am wrongly executed, this may be discreditable to those who wrongly put me to death, because if it is shameful to do wrong, it is surely shameful to do anything wrongly. But what disgrace is it to me if other people fail or decide or act rightly with regards to me? I see also that the reputation left to posterity by the dead is not the same for the doers as for the sufferers of wrong. I know that even if I die now, people will regard me and those who put me to death in a different light, for I know it will always be testified of me that I never wronged anyone and made anyone a worse person, but always tried to make my associates better people. Clearly, we need the account of Xenophon to get a fuller picture of the character of Socrates. And in this passage, it is interestingly framed that Socrates' lack of mounting a defense for his trial is more or less an act of indirect suicide. Xenophon's conclusion in the Memorabilia is this: "In my experience, Socrates was, as I have described him, so devout that he never did anything without the sanction of the gods, so upright that he never did the slightest harm to anyone, but conferred the greatest benefit upon those who associated with him, so self-disciplined that he never chose the more pleasant instead of the better course, so wise that he never made a mistake in deciding between better and worse, and needed no advice but was self-sufficient for such decisions. He was capable of explaining and defining such matters, and capable, moreover, of both assessing and refuting errors and encouraging people towards virtue and true goodness. In view of these qualities, he seems to me to be the perfect example of goodness and happiness. If anyone disapproves of this assessment, let him compare other people's characters with these qualities and then make his own decision." I hope you've enjoyed our brief survey of the Socrates we find in Xenophon, and for quite a while now we'll be transitioning into Plato and the Socrates we find there.